Hello everyone, welcome back to another day in the Clown Decade. Today we are covering a topic that I've been putting off for quite some time because I wanted to see exactly how these events played out, and honestly they're still ongoing. And if you couldn't tell from the title, we are of course going through the Insulate Britain protests. Now for those of you especially not in the UK, you may not have heard this news, but Insulate Britain are essentially a, let's say, spin-off of Extinction Rebellion, where they will do their best to shut down main streets around cities and, in this case, motorways. Their most famous being that they shut down the M25, which is the big motorway around London. And these type of protests has been going on for over a week, and it is quite clear to a lot of the public at this point that the police are being incredibly ineffective in getting the traffic moving again. And Insulate Britain's defence is much like Extinction Rebellion's. They say, they are peacefully protesting here. Well, I'm here to make a counterclaim on that. Because during these road blocking processes, we clearly have traffic issues. And traffic issues mean that emergency vehicles can't get to where they need to. And this ended up with a woman pleading for these people to move because her mother was in an ambulance trying to get to a hospital. Now, as you can see, this woman is pleading to basically save her mother's life. She is in an ambulance going to hospital for God knows what. It could be emergency surgery. It could be that she suffered a stroke and not getting to hospital could make her symptoms and life even worse if they don't make it there. And what do we have here on the screen? A couple of policemen on bikes doing absolutely nothing to alleviate the situation in any way. And this is a common complaint that we keep getting about Insulate Britain here in the UK. There's just no attempt to stop these ridiculous protests that are causing direct harm on people. This is infringing on people's rights. Their right to go about their business at the very least. And if you're stopping someone from getting to life-saving surgery, you are obviously committing some sort of crime there. So I don't know why the police aren't getting involved. But luckily we still have some chads in the public, as you can see in this clip.
He's waiting to get by. What fucking stupid question is that? You fucking idiot. He's asking if he's waiting to get by. There's a fucking ambulance, you stupid prick. Get out the road. No, there's a fucking ambulance. Not see it. Get out the fucking road. Get out the fucking road. You don't listen to him. It's an ambulance. Right, ambulance man, we'll get through. Wait, the fucking ambulance. Go. Oh, mate, you're a fucking dickhead. Go.
So as far as I'm concerned, these people are goddamn heroes. And it might not have been clear to, especially those outside the UK, but there were actually paramedics getting involved, moving these silly twats out of the way. And this is what happens when you have middle-class weaklings, essentially, versus the gruff chavs or working class of the United Kingdom, because these people appear to understand that people have lives they want to live, and there are bigger problems out there than feeling virtuous about oneself, by basically causing people to have massive delays in their days and potentially harming people because you're not allowing ambulances through to the hospital. So that was just a quick update on what Insulate Britain are doing at the moment. Police aren't doing anything about them. People come in and do their civic duty of protecting people's freeborn rights. But this isn't the main focus of the video. The main focus on the video has to do with this small clip brought out by Mike Galsworthy on his Twitter account about his new podcast about the climate crisis. Let's take a look.
What would you do in this situation if it was not an Insulate Britain protest, but a Roger Hallam protest? In that circumstance, what would you do?
I'd stay there.
You would?
Yeah.
So his initial answer is obvious for anyone who knows Roger Hallam, and don't worry, I'll do a quick profile on him in a second. But Roger Hallam, being the ex-leader of Extinction Rebellion, would obviously stay in the way, because he stayed in the way before. However, there is a follow-up question.
And if it were an ambulance and there was someone that could potentially die in there, would you stay there?
Yeah.
So I think this is the point where we can say that this man is an unironic terrorist. As this statement saying, I would allow someone to die via my actions for my political goals, although you could argue it's not direct violence, does still come under terrorism. As saying, I will block your path in order to stop you from saving your life for my political aims is quite clearly, if not necessarily violence, certainly a form of intimidation. Either follow all my commands or I will let people die. It's not quite the same as I will kill people directly, but I certainly think it crosses a line to be defined as terrorism. So I'll go through a quick profile on Roger Hallam, and you will probably see how he ended up coming to the conclusions he has come to. So before 2017, Roger Hallam, according to Wikipedia, was an organic farmer on a 10-acre farm near Llandylio in South Wales. He attributes the destruction of his business to a series of extreme weather events, which somehow he's the only farm in South Wales that suffered from these extreme weather events, but I suppose we can ignore that. After being a failed farmer between 2017 and at least 2019, he studied for a PhD at King's College London, specifically researching how to achieve social change through civil disobedience and radical movements. He essentially went to study intellectually as a revolutionary. And from there he co-founded Extinction Rebellion, helped write the book on Extinction Rebellion, which I have gone through in a previous video, link in the description, and came up with the idea for a citizens' assembly model, which is essentially an attempt to dilute power away from Westminster and the devoluted parliaments, and basically have it at the council level through direct democracy, which is basically just another thing that the socialists happen to want. But I suppose that's another fact we can ignore. So possibly due to being an academic, he has said some incredibly stupid things. And one of his main controversies, and the reason he is out of Extinction Rebellion, has to do with this little snippet from Die Zeit, a German magazine. So in their interview with him, they say, Roger Hallam, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, has said the Holocaust was just another fuckery in human history. Hallam believes the Germans' attitude towards the Holocaust is holding them back. The extremity of a trauma can create a paralysis is actually learning the lessons from it, he told the German weekly Die Zeit in an interview. Talking to Die Zeit, the 53-year-old British citizen, he's 53? I'm sorry, he looks really old for 53. But the 53-year-old British citizen referenced the Holocaust several times. The fact of the matter is, millions of people have been killed in vicious circumstances on a regular basis throughout history, Hallam said. He cites, for example, the Belgians, who went to the Congo in the late 19th century and decimated it. Now, I'd say Roger Hallam is technically correct that there have been many genocides throughout history. The thing that made the Holocaust so different is that it was incredibly industrial, and also the fact with it being so recent and also being specifically targeted at certain ethnicities, I'd say it's understandable that it has more of a focus as the ultimate worst genocide when compared to other genocides. Though in terms of raw number, obviously there have been worse ones, just look at any communist country. But my point is, if your words are being recorded in any situation, the last thing you should be doing is downplaying the Holocaust. If for nothing else other than the optics game, and this one sentence really did ruin Extinction Rebellion. They've barely been about since this sentence was said. And Extinction Rebellion even acknowledged this, So they said, following a review of the impact of Roger Hallam's actions and statements on the growth, morale and media coverage of our global movement, Extinction Rebellion Global Support is issuing this clarifying statement. Roger Hallam was one of the key founders of Extinction Rebellion when it started in the UK, and he no longer holds any formal role in Extinction Rebellion UK. He has never been a member of or held a position in Global Support. Additionally, he will not hold any role with Global Support nor be involved in any capacity with its future campaigns and strategy. He is persona non grata to Extinction Rebellion because of this, despite the fact that most people in Extinction Rebellion probably wouldn't be against a genocide to get less people on the planet to save the almighty CO2 emissions. But from there they go on, saying Roger Hallam has exhibited behaviour that, regardless of his intentions, has led to significant damage to our movement. So, for example, with the Holocaust comment, the German team cited a particularly heavy fall in their membership base, and was the first time Global Support Tech had seen negative growth since our global communications platform were deployed, with thousands of rebels leaving our platform. Radiohead decided to no longer donate. Extinction Rebellion Switzerland and Germany both reported that other local environmental groups sought to distance themselves from Extinction Rebellion. All because of this one thing he said. It should be obvious to anyone who has any public relations training, don't downplay the Holocaust. Calling it just another fuckery is actually underselling how industrial and planned it was. I would never call the Holodomor or any other genocide in communist countries another fuckery in human history. It was entirely planned and the people in charge didn't care. In fact, they actively thought it was a good thing. And that's not the only public relations nightmare he's had. There are many more, but I just want to point this out. Just because it shows that Roger Hallam is literally a maniac. On more than one occasion in 2020, Roger Hallam, quote-unquote, jokingly suggested that leaders responsible for the climate and ecological emergency should be shot. Joke or not, these statements damaged our otherwise strong commitment to non-violence in the public eye and increased concerns about Extinction Rebellion being classified as a terrorist organisation. Yes, and after what he said today in Mike Galsworthy's podcast, I can see why you'd want to distance yourself from him. The man is a maniac. Never give him any power. So speaking of Mike Galsworthy's podcast, I've actually downloaded the entire hour, and I'm going to pick out and comment on some of the highlights, because it's really interesting to see the type of people that actually sparks off a, quite frankly, massive global movement that has genuinely no substance to it. I mean, for God's sake, most of the people that go to the media as representatives of Extinction Rebellion, when they come out against people like Andrew Neil and are shown the facts, they instantly leave, well not instantly, but very shortly they leave Extinction Rebellion and start basically coming to my position on it, which is we're not at the end of the world, and the issues that CO2 are going to cause, while they will cost money in the future, we actually make more money by slowly moving towards green energy and nuclear, rather than having a full stop on it, doing what Germany did, which is not being prepared for that type of infrastructure and having to fire up the old coal power stations again. And as we've been doing that, while we have been having more extreme weather events, and some of them, although we're not too sure on it, seem to have become more extreme, we actually have the resources to protect people from it, so people are actually dying less from extreme weather events. But anyway, I think we should start to have a listen to the podcast now. Let's go. So this first clip, Roger has been asked exactly how he started Extinction Rebellion, and he was apparently a massive part of rent strikes and was organising canvassing and things like that around London already, so he was well known in the kind of London leftist, I guess you could call it, community. And so he met a few people who were worried about the climate crisis, and this is what he says.
And the first thing I said to them is the number one question if you want to win a campaign is, what are you dealing with? You know, if there's some litter out on the street outside this building, you don't need to blockade London, right? You just put a leaflet out, have a litter collecting session, maybe talk to your local councillor. Job done, right?
So yeah, this makes sense to me, and you probably don't even need to go that far. You just go around and actually pick up the litter yourself. But he's kind of going at the thin end of the wedge here, and this is what he says about his next mission.
Yeah.
You know, if you're trying to get better wages for casualised workers in London, then yeah, you may need to occupy one or two offices. That will get the job done. Going to talk to the boss won't.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the bigger your issue, the bigger he says you are justified in say, occupying an office in this case. And obviously, if you've got a few bits of litter on a street outside your office, yeah, you're not going to occupy London and say, get rid of the litter. That would look ridiculous. But it doesn't seem to realise that someone like me, and hopefully many of you viewers, doing all the occupying any sort of office seems a really weird thing to protest for basically anything. And I think this is actually a problem generally with the right wing. We don't do cringe LARPy things like that, but as Roger Hallam says here, it tends to work. And well, why does it work? Well, you have people like Roger Hallam who are true believers about these things, and through his PhD in marketing, media and civil disobedience and all that, he's worked out basically that Rules for Radicals really does work. And he even says in the Extinction Rebellion book, you can get tens of thousands of people to lock down London following what he does. And lo and behold, those tactics are still being used by other groups because clearly they work. Yeah, it annoys some people, but why do they care? Look at what the government's doing. They're going full-on net zero in God knows what year it is now. It used to be 2050, but I think they keep bringing it back. And so if it's working at the thinner end of the wedge, you just have to work out how to widen that wedge, and he goes into it here.
If you're trying to sort out the climate crisis, then that's massive. It's not massive for, that's not a political statement. It's analytical. I'm a designer. I'm not that interested in the ins and outs and the rights and wrongs of things. I'm more interested, as a scholar anyway.
So this is just a basic admission of, I do not care about morals, I just care about reaching goals. And I mean, even by that point, I don't necessarily believe that. Clearly he thinks it's right that people get higher wages. He's basically a socialist, from what I can tell. So clearly he does have a sense of right and wrong, but he seems to not give a single thought to that of, do the ends justify the means? He just thinks, I've got these ends, any means will do to get to it. And this is clear in these statements. The man is basically a psychopath.
In how you can design something. And what I said to them is, okay, so the climate crisis, it's universal, undeniably universal. It's affecting everyone in the world. It's existential, which is this nice, polite word for billions of people are going to die if it's not sorted out.
And that sentence alone shows me that he clearly thinks that there is a sense of right and wrong. But ultimately it's hyper-utilitarian. As he says, his mission is to save as many lives as possible, whether they be in the future or present. And this, I think, is why he says later, yes, I would stop an ambulance that could save a single person from getting through my blockade. Because he genuinely believes that he's going to save billions of people. Because I think it's just so arrogant to think that. There is no report that supports that view. No serious scientific report says that billions of people are going to die. There's no evidence for this. And yet apparently he's uber analytical. Apparently he cares about ends and means and all that. Yet he just seems to be completely rejecting any analysis on this.
So I said the only way you're going to be able to deal with it is through systemic change. And again, systemic change is a nice, polite word for social disruption leading to, a major change in political structures.
Yep.
You can use a few other words there if you like.
And Roger Hallam keeps doing this thing where he accidentally lets his mask slip. He keeps saying that I am using nice, polite words for good optics, but there's no point in doing that if you just come on a public podcast and say, by the way, when I say these things, I actually mean much worse things than I'm saying. And when he says directly you can put a few other words in there, well, when you say social disruption, why can't I just replace that with something like stochastic terrorism? Which is essentially a way of saying you are encouraging terrorism without directly saying it. Like you said in the clip I showed earlier when you said, yes, I would let someone die in an ambulance for the sake of saving billions in my mind. That just directly encourages people to do that because they see you as their leader. You need to be responsible here, and you're not being at all.
Winning a campaign is about power. It's about the application of power against your opponent's power. And, that's a strategic point. Obviously, we can talk about the morality of it as well, which is a parallel argument, which is if something's really bad, then you're justified in doing bad things in order to put it right.
So this is a pretty basic power analysis, and it's not necessarily wrong. It's just the problem is that when you bring everything down to this my power versus your power, you miss so much context of the real world that you do just seem like a psychopath. There's more to a campaign, obviously, than just power, but this is my problem with Roger Hallam, because he does actually bring up the issues of morality. Am I justified in applying my power in this way? But the problem is he's admitted before that he doesn't care about moral issues. So having someone in a position of power who is influencing the power of the masses, let's say, if they are doing that and at the same time they don't really care about morals, then I don't see how you're not going to end up with anything short of a, kind of Soviet revolution. And then people who have a larger vision for the power you have clearly exacerbated, they will worm their way into your right hand and then shoot you in the side of the head to take that power. Whereas if you have a proper cohesive moral system that binds people together, you'll end up with a higher trust society and community. But Roger doesn't care about that, because Roger thinks that doing it this way saves billions of people. Or maybe he doesn't, and that's just his justification.
Mm-hmm. And that's a basis of English common law, just, as a little aside. The right of necessity says in the Great Fire of London, people knocked down houses in the city without asking the owners. Right, that's illegal.
Just to make the fire breaks, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It was justified. It was a right of necessity. You're either going to knock the house down or you're going to have the whole of London burned down. You've got to create this.
Yep. So you do this now, and then you compensate later or whatever. Yeah. But everyone understands you've got to get it on.
And it's a principle, right?
Yeah.
It's a principle that everyone accepts. And of course, in any particular context, you have to analyse whether that's justifiable or not.
And herein comes the problem. With the Great Fire of London, it was justified for the Navy to use their gunpowder to blow up buildings and stop the whole of London burning down, as you say. But given all the studies that go into climate science and all that, no actual reputable source says that we are going to be in an apocalypse. There's no reliable source that says it's going to cause billions of deaths. The sources do say things need to be done about it, such as maintaining extreme weather defences, moving slowly away from fossil fuels to more, for the sake of argument, we'll just say renewable, but nuclear really does seem to be the way forward. And this is what most governments in the world seem to be doing, apart from the obvious of China, which is firing up a load of coal power stations again. So from the actual scientific research, it seems to be that no, you are not justified in allowing people to die in ambulances for your moral virtue.
What I find most fascinating about this is I think there's probably a lot of people that think Extinction Rebellion just grows out of the loony left, and it's people just, panicking about stuff so they're prepared to do anything.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong there, are you, Mike? I mean, I only say this because I've written a lot of their literature and their literal handbook.
But it's not. It actually comes from design principles up front from a workshop of this is the scale of the problem, so this is the extremity of measures needed according to what we know about campaigning. So
I absolutely love that that was his defence for saying it's not just the loony net left. He's basically just said, no, righties, you don't understand. We're actually very organised about this. And he uses the term, this is what we know and this is what we have to do to alleviate the damages of what we know. But what he really means is, here's what we think. Here are the cherry-picked worst-case scenario articles that we find. And quite a lot of scientists are actually against climate cultists. They do think, and I agree, generally, yes, the climate is getting warmer. Yes, humans have some hand in it. But they also agree that humans can have some hand in mitigating it and raising the defences against what will be, probably, more extreme weather events. Whether they're worse or not is still yet to be concluded.
It's designed to be different from other kinds of campaigning because it's at a different level and scale from most other campaigns that you will see around which are dealing with smaller issues.
Well, it came out of an intellectual project, if the truth be known. And that intellectual project had one question, which is, why over the last 30 years has the environmental movement catastrophically failed to stop the increase in carbon emissions?
Well, one of the biggest reasons for that is because they kept getting the science wrong, and they keep getting the science wrong because the science is never settled. So you say, why over 30 years haven't they managed to do anything productive? Well, the reason is because they thought the world was going to freeze over. We were going to have ice caps coming all the way down to London, according to them, which did happen in previous ice ages. But then that narrative took a whole 180, and then it turned into global warming or global heating. which then, because it was so doomsday, Frank Luntz could easily just say, oh, well, if we just call it climate change, it sounds less dangerous. And the reason that stuck is because climate cultists were constantly going overboard, saying how bad things were going to get. And what's Roger Hallam doing? He's taking that, saying, right, we're going to keep the doomsday narrative, but then we're going to show we're serious by doing harsher and harsher protests. And that in turn will convince enough people. It has convinced enough people. You ask most millennials and Zoomers what they think the biggest problem in the world is at the moment, they will say climate change. But I wouldn't, because I went through this science in uni.
So the bottom line, there's always a bottom line, right? The bottom line is carbon emissions have increased by 60% since 1990, when the world was told categorically by scientists that we're heading for the collapse of civilization, or whatever other word you want to use, if we don't cut carbon emissions.
So I'm just quickly going to go through those claims. First things first, 60% increase in carbon emissions since 1990. Yeah, that's pretty accurate if you just look at this. But what he seems to ignore is that when it comes to the US and Europe, our emissions seem to be dropping. He just seems to completely miss that it's East Asia that is the majority of this increase since 1990. So why he's focusing on the Western Hemisphere in general, I have no idea. But as he said, he's very analytic, what can I say? But he also makes the claim that scientists said that we were heading for disaster in 1990. So I've got the IPCC report from Cambridge University, which is basically the holy bible of climate change science. And you can go through the rest of this executive summary yourself. Once again, it will be in the description. But just for some quick asides on this, it basically says that plant life grows at a much larger rate with more CO2 and more warming in the climate, meaning reforestation and storage of CO2 from the atmosphere will probably increase over time, so that's already a negative feedback loop that no one talks about. Next, it says that animals will likely have to migrate, and quite a lot will manage to do this by going to higher or lower latitudes, depending which hemisphere you're in, and by going up higher altitudes such as mountains. However, we will probably see some small-scale extinctions, especially for animals that have very small habitats. It then says that humans are causing some problems with, say, deforestation and things like that, though widespread fertilisation and farming is actually help with the sequestration of carbon emissions. And it also says that marine currents may be affected by the changing climate, and this may affect plankton growth, which may hinder or even help with even more taking out of carbon emissions from the atmosphere. One thing that's very common in this whole thing is that, one, it is not saying that we are heading towards an apocalypse, and two, they make it very clear that these are all estimations that are very much hampered due just to the nature of the complexity of the climate. And these things are constantly said in every IPCC report since. You cannot make the claims Roger is making here.
Putting your life into something and working really hard is no guarantor in itself of success. Success is really the product of intellectual analysis, right?
Yep.
So Extinction Rebellion wasn't like Occupy, right? Occupy was great and all the rest of it, but Occupy came out of a surge of enthusiasm. It wasn't pre-designed. Extinction Rebellion came out of a pre-designed process where people sat down.
So that's the distinction that I was
and that's why it was successful.
Highlighting.
Now, from what I could understand from this part, they say we are a successful movement. I mean, before he was saying we are successful if we reach the goals, which is systemic change. And his main systemic change that he wants is these citizens' assemblies. But now here he's saying Extinction Rebellion was successful just because it had intellectuals at the helm. Which, don't get me wrong, you do need some intellectuals on your side to basically come up with the end game you will see fit for the future if, in this case, you are going after systemic change, which Occupy Wall Street definitely were after, and so are Extinction Rebellion. But neither, I think you can say, have been successful, because we still don't have citizens' assemblies, and Occupy Wall Street died within a year. So next, Galsworthy brings up that people like Nigel Farage and Andrew Neil have both interviewed Roger Hallam and basically said, can you calm down a bit, please? Stop shutting down London and actually talk to us and come forward with something constructive beyond we need to save the climate crisis and have citizens' assemblies. because they aren't really direct solutions to what you're after. And this is what Roger had to say about that.
Yeah, I think what right-wing commentators make the mistake of doing is confusing morality with effectiveness. Those are two different analyses. Like, you might not like people sitting in the road. That's fair enough. But that's a separate question from whether it's effective or not.
So this is the issue with this. No, the right-wingers do understand the difference between effectiveness and morality. Their issue is that you are being incredibly effective at being immoral. And an even bigger problem is that your immorality is very effective. And the problem with that is that you're going to carry on doing that to the point where an 81-year-old who is in an ambulance with her daughter pleading with you to please get out of the way so they can save her life, that is seen as a morally good thing by you. And to make that even worse, it is effective and immoral. That is the last thing on the planet you should be trying to advocate for.
I would say it's the same with some of the characters in the pro-Brexit campaign. Morality sort of went out the window with regard to truth, but you can't argue that Dominic Cummings was effective.
And this is what I find so hilarious about Mike Galsworthy, and I've not brought it up in this video, but basically Mike Galsworthy started the Scientists for the EU project. And in 2016 he was basically the most annoying man on Twitter. He was essentially the Stop Brexit man on Twitter for scientists. And, you know, he had all his reasonings for wanting to stay in the EU as a scientist and things like this, and that's all fine. The problem is that Brexit isn't really a moral issue. But the reason he brings this up is because he does think Brexit is a moral issue, but also wants to say that the people in charge of the Brexit campaign were very effective with what they were doing. It's just funny because Brexit does live in the guy's head rent-free, so that's why I wanted to bring it up. But it's also that people sitting in the middle of the road and allowing people to die, in his mind, is on the same level as Brexit, which it just isn't.
That's basically what I study, is how people can take appropriate action, obviously, in order to get a reality, a moral reality in front of the population.
So again, he says, oh, right-wingers don't understand the difference between morality and effectiveness. And then right here, he's making moral statements, but at the same time saying, yes, I want to make moral statements and make them effective. Yet right-wingers understand this. We do understand this. But it's that we think the effective tactics you are using are immoral and not justifiable. That is something that leftists don't seem to get. On the bright side, he goes on a big talk about why he thinks non-violent revolution is a lot more effective than violent revolution, which I do agree with. But we can skip over the details of that. But after all that, the question is asked that I really want answered, which is what he thinks Extinction Rebellion actually achieved with its civil disobedience. Because from my opinion of it, all they did was really annoy the actual people and the actual voters, and they don't seem to have much more support for things like a Green New Deal in Labour or the actual Green Party, which they were pushing anyway. And the only real difference that we have now from 2019 is that Labour insist on calling the Green New Deal the Socialist Green New Deal, which doesn't have anything to do with the climate. They care more about pushing their socialism than they do actually about the climate. But we'll let him get into it.
Well, if you remember, like, you know, when we were looking at doing mass civil disobedience at the beginning of 2019, lots of people said, no one's interested. No one's interested in the climate. Everyone, the news agenda was dominated by Brexit.
I don't know who the hell was saying that, because climate was always at the forefront of the news. I made my channel to start dispelling the crap that is coming out of people like Roger Hallam. I mean, it brings up Brexit, and yeah, Brexit did take up a lot more headlines than it really should have. But climate cultism was always next on the list. The alarmism's been going on for years. I remember fracking being a massive issue because they were going on about the climate. Anyway, he brings up the same climate alarmist talking points that I can't be bothered going through again, to eventually actually answer the question, which was, how were the Extinction Rebellion protests successful?
I think it did two things. It made the government, it made the parliament say that there's a climate and ecological emergency. That's number one. Mm-hmm. And number two is it changed the national conversation.
Wow, you got politicians to pander to you. Not by actually changing policy, though. Even the Tories are saying that they're going to ban petrol cars in about a decade, and they keep bringing back net zero carbon emissions. But this is what I mean, it's all talk. I mean, realistically, they keep being told this will just harm the poorest in society and probably kill people. Probably kill more people than if we just carry on as we are anyway. When really the solution should be somewhere in the middle ground. But also the second thing, we've got people talking about it. Well, you're not wrong, I'm talking about it, and I'm pointing out everything you're saying that is complete baloney. As in many interviewers, and when this is pointed out to your supporters, they quite quickly move away from Extinction Rebellion because they realise what they're actually after is mental. Though he does mention that in a poll by probably YouGov, they discovered that about 60-odd% of people accept there's a climate emergency. The problem with polls like that is that they can never actually define what is meant by that. I mean, the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, did polls on Zoomers and millennials to say, do you agree with socialism or capitalism, etc. But then when they were actually given the actual definitions of these things, over 60% of them either didn't know or got it wrong. So basically, unless the climate emergency is very much well defined in that poll, you can basically dismiss it as most of the people there don't even know what that means. So anyway, Rogers then asked who the most resistant parties are in the world against Extinction Rebellion.
Well, there's no surprises the rich and powerful are most resistant.
Yeah, no, absolutely every company in the world is completely following you on the climate emergency, or at least pandering to you in some way. Though when reality hits, they realise, we can't actually do what they want, it would bankrupt everyone for a start, and just be absolutely impossible to implement in the time frame that they want. And even if they didn't go straight to bankruptcy, prices for everyone's energy and standard of living would go up so much, it would be absolutely pointless. So this is what he means by the rich and powerful against him. He doesn't mean anyone in particular, it's just a neat thing to say. But in reality, you go on any website, and every website now has either declared a climate emergency or has a clear plan for how they're going to try and go to net carbon neutral or something, and most of them are just doing something as far as going paperless. But to say that they are against Extinction Rebellion is ridiculous. You had so many celebrities fly over from America, yes, they flew by the way, to join in with the Extinction Rebellion protests in England. Don't give me that guff. So after skipping a bit about how to basically be an activist and to influence people and politicians, he ends up coming out with this beauty.
The climate crisis is massive. It's objectively systemic in the sense that you're going to have to change the whole economy, right? That's not a postmodernist proposition. It's it's similar to your children are burning on the top floor of your house. There is only one thing to do. You have to break the door down and run upstairs and rescue them.
So I wanted to put in that analogy because it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. He's so sure about his convictions on the climate crisis, quote unquote, that he thinks it's analogous to a burning house with your children. That's how quickly it's going to affect us. But I also love how every time they go on about the climate crisis or ecological disaster or something like that, there's only one solution ever. Just put in socialism, put in this other economic system that I've been going on about for decades, but this climate crisis, I've been going on for a few years. It just happens that my old solutions to everything wrong in the world will solve this as well. Get stuffed. Not only have you told me you don't care about morality, you only care about effectiveness, but you also only seem to care about the economy. This is what you would call the mask slipping. I don't believe Roger Hallam when he says he truly believes that there is only one thing to do here to save the planet. I think he knows. There's no way you can't know that things are being done to sequester carbon emissions, which seems to be the only thing people care about when it comes to the climate for some reason. But then it just so happens that his model for politics and the economy is the only one that can save it. Just so happens to be that one. And that's why it's so easy to get socialists on board. You just say something is a systemic problem, boom, you've got socialists on. And there's another thing I want to bring up. He keeps bringing up children.
The climate crisis exists, whether you deal with it or not. It's an objective reality. It's death. It's cancer. It's your children's illness. These aren't things you mess about with.
He'll always say in every interview it's other people's children, it's never his. I get the feeling that, I don't know if he's married or not, but I am pretty certain he doesn't have kids. Because if your whole point is that I am doing this to save children, you'd put your own family first to be like, look, this is a more personal connection. Though I suppose trying to guilt other people by saying, look, it's your children who will be effective, may be a bit more effective. But my point here is to say that if you don't have kids, you can't really care that much about the future. And this is how his mask slipped earlier. He doesn't care about morality, he only cares about effectiveness. He knows it's effective to bring up children as moral pawns. Having none himself, I am not surprised he would be psychopathic enough to try and guilt you into his positions using your children as, almost as a threat. So, as you can probably tell by this point, most of this podcast has been about Roger Hallam repeating unfounded climate alarmism points. Though he does keep bringing up revolution. And this is where he finally gets to his point about what he sees, what an actual revolution is.
When we talk about revolutions, it's not like I'm being unpleasant. It's like solid social science. When you get a social system that is under an enormous pressure because it's living a massive lie, whether it's, Newtonian physics or whether it's climate crisis, you get this sudden shift very quickly.
A revolution is no more than a rapid evolution. When you hit a circumstance where you actually need to evolve very, very quickly in order to keep going.
But the key difference with the climate crisis is there's an objective cutoff point.
Yes.
Right? That's what makes it metaphysically different to any other crisis in human history.
So basically, in their view, and it's a view I generally agree with, a revolution is simply a huge change in their minds, power structure. In my mind, it's a change of way more than that. It would be a change of politics as well. It would be a change of culture. And if you think everything's derived simply from power, then I can see why power would only matter in your mind of a revolution. But if you read any sort of history, say it be the Peasants' Revolt, the Russian Revolution, it's about way more than power. And this is an issue that a lot of postmodernists have, because Roger Hallam keeps saying, I'm not postmodernist, and I'm not just coming up with postmodernist ideas, but it is. It's entirely postmodernist. And when all you care about is power, and you also don't care about morals, you are a psychopath in the making. Thank God he doesn't hold any real power. He is essentially an astroturfed, useful idiot.
Now, what's happening with world society at the moment is it is going to fall off that cliff, which makes it absolutely strategically and morally imperative that we engage in high-level civil disruption.
So again, the man's a psychopath. Morals, in his mind, only matter when they are his morals. They are beneficial, for lack of a better term, to him. The man essentially was a farmer for 20 years, couldn't sustainably run it since it was organic and he needed a few pesticides he refused to use, then blamed it on an external catastrophe, basically, which if he was from any other point in time, he would have just blamed it on the devil, and then makes demands of society itself. That is not what a normal or constructive human being should be doing. But he's not the only person I've seen to do this. I know people who own small businesses in my town, and when they failed after a few years because they couldn't run it sustainably, they blame outside sources. They blame the Tories or something and then become rabid socialists. Just because it's different from what they have now, and what we have now they see as failing them. Despite the fact that in quite a few of these cases, it's through their own failures. And failure isn't a bad thing. Every path to success is paved with them. But if you stop on that path at a certain failure and go, oh, this needs to be an outside source, you're basically then asking, in fact, no, you are demanding other people create the rest of the path for you. And I just see that as weak. So next, Galsworthy brings the conversation onto the Insulate Britain clips that I showed before. And he points out that what Insulate Britain are doing, especially with the clip of the woman trying to get her grandmother to the hospital, is that they seem to be being counterproductive in their aims. In short, they are turning the public against them. And so Hallam is asked about this.
What we have to understand in terms of how political change works, progressive political change works, is a group in society is subject to injustice and the rest of society doesn't want to hear it. They don't want to deal with it.
Yep.
Yeah, history doesn't particularly support this point, I'm afraid, especially British history. The whole abolition of slavery, that was vastly popular with the public, to the point that they had a mile-long parchment with a petition of people supporting abolition of the slave trade. And it became a point of national pride that whenever a slave ship was captured by the West African Squadron or any other part of the Royal Navy, there were celebrations throughout Britain where no one was allowed to be a slave since the times of William the Conqueror. So no, it's not true that people don't want to hear about injustices going on in the world. What annoys people is when you act like an entitled bunch of children wanting society to change for their benefit. What was different about slavery is that it was a Christian group initially who came up with the action and plans to petition and lobby the government into their position of abolishing the slave trade in the early 19th century. That's different to the activism we see from Extinction Rebellion, where they're trying to bring all this nonsense towards us to convince us that our children are going to die thanks to the climate, and bring in socialism because of that. It's just so easy to see through. But Roger Hallam's trying to avoid this point, obviously, because he really wants to be in charge of a citizens' assembly.
And there's always a progression. So you have to see this over a period of time. You can't just look at today or even next week or even next year, right? And there's a confusion. And the confusion is people look at the time at which the disruption is happening and say, the public's against you, which is true. But what's also true is over time, the public comes on side.
Yeah, again, we can't really say that from the polls you're putting up, because polls where it says, do you think there's a climate emergency, people will say yes and not really know what that means. But if that's all you're after, fair enough. However, you're also having massive issues with what you're doing. You are actually getting the government to have popular support for things like the new police bills and things like that. And they're even coming out with legislation just this week to stop Insulate Britain from doing what they're doing. In short, you seem to be completely ignoring the fact you are undermining your own tactics here. And once they've been undermined, no one's going to be listening to you anymore. People will say there's a climate emergency to sound trendy, and that'll be it. Nothing will actually be done about it, apart from what the Tories are already doing, which is banning petrol cars in a few years and declaring we need net zero by 2050, or even earlier now.
And the reason for that is the disruption itself. In other words, the disruption creates two things. It creates a polarization. People are against you. Why are you blocking the roads? You're blocking people. But over the longer term, they go, that was justified because of the objective injustice that those people were highlighting through the disruption.
So for a start, I love how he only goes to the lowest common denominator of people's complaints, which is you're blocking people. What the main concern was, as I've mentioned, and as was shown at Insulate Britain, people might be dying because of this. People are losing their livelihoods because of this. People's lives might be disrupted to the point that they lose jobs because of your disruption. And I am yet to see people outside of Labour and the Greens who are saying what he is saying, that they are justified in this. Because it's basically no one but upper normies, as Christian Niemiec puts it. So while he's on the subject of revolution, I just find this amazing. He brings up Martin Luther King and says, oh, he was seen as a revolutionary that not many people particularly liked in America. And then he says this.
The point is through persisting in the disruption, there's a breakthrough point. And that breakthrough point comes very fast, right? It's a non-linear thing, like this revolutionary idea, right? So by 1968, he's a saint.
And you've got to realise, this is how Roger Hallam sees himself. He sees himself as the persecuted Martin Luther King of the climate crisis. And this, in the end, might be what he's after. He might just want the status of being saint-like for the secular religion of the climate crisis. I'm just saying it all adds up with every other psychopathic thing he's said. And then he echoes Saul Alinsky of, do particular ends justify particular means? And in this case, he calls himself objectively right over and over again, and that is incredibly disturbing.
The reason why Extinction Rebellion is going to win in the long term and Insulate Britain is because we're objectively right, in the sense that it's objectively right to be against rape. It's objectively right to be against child abuse.
So, I mean, depending on your thoughts on objective and subjective morality, I think what he means by objectively right here is that everyone agrees that rape and child molestation are moral evils. But as he said before, he doesn't care about morals. He cares about effectiveness. And so you've got to bear in mind, he's saying a lot of these things because they are good optics. And then his mask starts to slip when he feels that he's in a comfortable enough position to let it slip, essentially. Hence he made his Holocaust comments, I think. But it's this really weird thing of, we've got this massive global scale climate catastrophe in his opinion, and yet at the same time he's comparing that to individual acts such as rape and child molestation, which of course can be systematic as well. But he's making it a very individual moral episode, essentially. And that's a very strange thing to compare a worldwide catastrophe, in his opinion, to. And it's because, basically, it pulls at your heartstrings, as Jonathan Haidt would say. That makes your elephant want to sympathise with him.
It's objectively right not to send the next generation to hell. There's no doubt about that, right? There's no culture in the world that sends its children to hell. But that's what this society is doing.
And just to bring up Jonathan Haidt again, this is one of the great lies told to kids in America and probably in the rest of the West, which is that life is a battle between good versus evil, and this is Roger Hallam's mind. It is good, his activists, the people who are saying there's a climate crisis and disrupting London and other places, they're the objectively good people. The objectively bad people are the Tories or something, or people like me probably. And that is a very dangerous mindset to have. That is why we have a lot of issues politically that we have today.
And that's what you should focus on, is the 30% of the British public that supports us sitting in the road. Yep. Don't you think that's interesting? Because if we were just sitting in the road because, we wanted, a little bit more money for ourselves, something objectively selfish, 99% of the British public would be going, get them off the road, throw them in prison. The fact that there's 30% of the British public going, fair enough. Why are they going fair enough? Because they've made that transition to understand we're dealing with an objective moral catastrophe in this country.
See, this is the thing. He thinks that everyone who supports them is basically thinking the way he is. No, a lot of people are literally just NPCs and say things that are of the upper normie opinion. Saying we need climate action, things like this, that is just something people say to sound good. And that's the 30% there. They are not thinking, they are just going, oh, climate catastrophe, yeah, that's bad. Oh, I agree with you. Yeah, sit in the middle of the road. And that probably makes up the majority of them. There will be some true believers out there, but there will also be a vast subsection that are there supporting the socialist policies that XR keep pushing forward. They'll just like them basically because they're anti-capitalist, but Hallam will not even dignify accepting that that could be a possibility. And the only reason because of that I can think of is because it undermines his position. But there we go. So after this, Gláeddyv then puts forward the completely sane idea that blocking people from going to the hospital shows that these people are psychopaths, and that's pretty bad optics. But what I'm putting in as a clip here, I lost it.
It's like the terrorism thing, right? Like poor analogy, but
he completely loses his composure because he realises he's called Insulate Britain essentially terrorists, and then he says, oh, that's a bad analogy, and then he's trying to pick back up his words, but he can't because he realises that, wow, that's actually a pretty good point. I can make a really good analogy there. That he's essentially called what he generally supports, which is a, climate activist group. He's basically called them terrorists and is like, wow, I could actually call them that unironically without thinking about it, and it's a really good fit. But just the way he lost his composure, I found that gravy. So Roger Hallam obviously has a reply to this.
There are points at which...
There's no question that you can go too far, right?
Yes.
Everyone agrees that.
Okay.
The question is, how far do you go?
Yes.
Totally. My analysis, for what it's worth, is you have to go pretty far. You have to go a lot further than what is conventionally considered like appropriate.
Comfortable.
So, in Roger Hallam's words, you can go too far, and he basically says, yes, we do have to go too far. Well, as far as I'm concerned then, what's your line? Because obviously I know you have the line of no direct violence. But then you've got this problem of indirect violence, where you say you will... I mean, he's not said it in the podcast yet, but he said it in the clip before. That basically he'd let people die for his cause. And this is exactly why Mike Goldsworthy says that there is a good analogy to terrorism, but then has to try and backtrack it by stumbling over his words. As I say, the man is a psychopath. So again, Goldsworthy keeps trying to lay on the optic argument, saying, look, basically, if you are going to be this inhumane to people who are trying to, get their ill mothers to hospital, is that really a good idea? And then, he says the question with the clip at the start, which I will play again.
What would you do in this situation if it was not an Insulate Britain protest, but a Roger Hallam protest? In that circumstance, what would you do?
I'd stay there.
You would?
Yeah.
And if it were an ambulance and there was someone that could potentially die in there, would you stay there?
Yeah.
So now you've got the full context for that. Essentially, Mike is trying to say to him, please just say you'll let an ambulance through. That's what he's been trying to say for about 10 minutes here. He's just like, please say you will let people live. And Hallam's just like, nah. So, I mean, God help. I really hope he has a good explanation for this.
So you would be prepared for someone to die in an ambulance being blocked by you personally?
I wouldn't construct it like that, right? Let me just finish, right? Because you've said your little framing, which makes me look like some devil, right?
I absolutely love this. This is worse than I could have thought. He's not trying to backtrack at all here. Goldsworthy's like, so you'll let someone die, right? And Roger Hallam's like, whoa. Let's not frame it like that. You're making me seem evil here. Go on then, Hallam. Explain to me how letting someone die via your action, not inaction, but action, can possibly be justified.
This is the framing that I promote,
okay,
right? Which is, we have a government that's systematically facilitating the destruction of this country, right? Objectively. That's the situation. We have 3 or 4 years in order to make this change.
For sure.
We're looking at the death of billions of people, potentially.
Right, I want to stop it there, because this is the thing that really gets me every time. He'll blame it on the system and all this, and he'll use classic Marxist and commie propaganda words to make his point. And then he'll end up saying, oh, people might die. And, he'll say billions, without probably realising that billions of people have died in the past for numerous reasons anyway. And yeah, maybe we can reduce the amount of future deaths with action now. But as he says, it's a probability. But we definitely know someone is going to die if you get in the way, and that is why it is framed as, you are an evil person, Hallam. Because you are. I mean, again, he tries to bring in civil rights in America and the suffragettes to say, oh, people got hurt by these things. And he finishes off by saying this.
Civil resistance is not purist, elite university ethics course discussion stuff. People get hurt in political disruption.
Sure.
When workers, let me just say,
by accident.
when workers,
and Goldsworthy interrupting, saying, yeah, but that's usually by accident, isn't it? He's giving him so many open goals, and Hallam's just like, no, I want people to die so I can save millions more. I know utilitarians are absolute morons, but I never thought I'd hear one ever saying I actively want people to die for my utilitarian ends.
What we have to understand here is this is how democracy works. Democracy works through social conflict, but that social conflict is always limited. And that's how we avoid civil wars. That's how we avoid major social disruption. And what civil resistance is saying is those people have an absolute line, right? And that absolute line is that they will be entirely non-violent.
So, by this logic, Hallam, democracy hasn't actually solved anything. You say in the same breath that democracy was there to have social conflict but avoid social disruption. And then you're saying, oh, this is how democracy works, by the way, by putting in social disruption. But you're apparently excused from your social disruption because it happens to be non-violent. You're not trying to abet warfare, we'll say.
When they're sitting in the road, what they're saying is the government has had 4 weeks to make a statement to say, we will enact our primary responsibility under the British Constitution to the British people and start to decarbonise, right? 4 weeks. So they have to take some responsibility for the disruption.
That is amazing logic right there. He has basically said that either the government gives in to our demands or every death is their fault. No, Roger, that is not how responsibility of these things work. That is the thought process of a goddamn terrorist.
Right? the police and the highway agency have to take responsibility for the disruption because they refuse to enact the law to slow down the traffic.
And this is the part where the logic's just lost on me. I can't even follow that. Apparently, if the police and the highway code say you have to slow down, that'll stop the disruption, which it won't, by the way, but apparently because they didn't do that, it's their fault as well. Just externalising everything about anyone who's on his side.
Do the protesters take any responsibility?
Of course, but it's justified. The protesters are justified, as in all real-life moral situations.
That is amazing. He's basically said that, yes, there is some responsibility on our part, but it's justified on our part. When it comes to the government and the highway code and the police, oh no, they're not justified. He's basically put all responsibility away from the protesters to them, despite just saying, yes, there is some responsibility on them. This actually got way, way worse than I thought it ever could. I thought he'd try and roll back what he said in that clip. No, apparently he doubles down and even says it's the government's fault. So Gláeddyv again is just constantly trying to give him an open goal to roll back what he said. And he ends up saying this, which I think is the most sensible thing I've ever heard Gláeddyv say.
It's like when we were talking before about terrorism, you know, everyone's got their level. I support road blockages. I support disruption. I think it needs to be bothering people on a daily basis. But you were saying yourself, you know, that makes me look like a demon. Well, then don't demonize yourself.
I mean, it's so obvious. He's literally saying, please roll back what you said. It is evil. And this is what Hallam says.
Yeah.
That would be my take on it.
Well, we agree to disagree then, don't we? You know,
Evidently,
it's a rabbit hole that the media wants to run around. I mean, we've been, talking for half an hour and you spent like 10 minutes on one person.
Peak utilitarian talking point. And it's not even the same as the trolley problem. It's not even the 1 versus 5 people on the tracks for whatever reason. It's one person die now, or in the future, a few more might die. We're not entirely sure exactly how many it'll be, and they might even be saved by other means. That's the moral problem, and he'd rather guarantee the one death than take the chance of no one dying. It's incredible.
Look, it's a rabbit hole, right?
Yeah.
It's like a witch hunt. Whatever you say, you're fucked, right? It's like, this is how the media works. They pick out a little instance, right? It's a tragic instance, but it's a small instance, and they just milk it for all it's
and
worth.
they will.
Yeah, and this is exactly what happened to Sargon. But the thing is with Sargon, he never said that he'd let someone die. In fact, he said he'd do the good thing and said he wouldn't even rape an MP. Problem with that is, though, as Mike Gláeddyv keeps trying to drill into your head, Hallam, that's really bad optics. And again, he's trying to get you to roll it back. He's basically asking you, why are you giving them open goals? And this is exactly what Sargon had to realise through trial by ordeal. He realised, look, optics do matter. I have to get off YouTube, I have to make my own media company, and on there I have to be incredibly professional and have good optics. And no matter how many times it has to be drilled into Hallam's head, he'll just keep doubling down on it. If he was in Sargon's position, he'd probably try and join another political party and do the same thing. The man's insane. So Gláeddyv tries to get him to clarify his point at the very least by saying this.
That would indicate to me that if this incident did happen, you would think that's actually, and bear in mind my provocative phrasing here, a good thing, because then it would elevate the issue to absolute national discussion, national catastrophe.
So basically a person dying to him would be a good thing because at least it gets a conversation starting. This is how Hallam responds.
I think you've argued yourself into the opposite position, which is yes, you know, if someone died, it would be a massive matter of public debate.
Yes.
And massive public debates is what changes public consciousness.
Amazing. He doesn't even consider the fact that it would be a tragedy. It'd be a massive, massive, massive tragedy to a family for that person. It would cause great upset to a local family and, by extension, probably a local community. He doesn't realise that that's a one-way ticket to being enemies, but he doesn't care, because all he cares about, like a lot of people, is doing incredibly immoral stuff just to then get a conversation started. That is pure evil.
So if that were to happen, then it would be a huge boost for the cause of
It
extinction,
may be,
rebellion, and people
but
like you.
if you're going to be honest with yourself, historically, if you're going to be honest, right, tragedies where people die do create political change.
They do.
It's amazing how Roger Hallam would say this. He basically says massive tragedies change the course of public debate and things like this, without realising that even just downplaying the Holocaust caused him to be persona non grata and just reduced Extinction Rebellion's worldwide influence massively. And that was without anyone even dying. So just, if someone actually died that was directly caused by him and he just waved it off as, oh yeah, at least we're talking about the things I want to talk about though, he'll seem like a psychopath. It's incredible how flippant he is about the thought of causing someone's death and then saying, yeah, but it might be advantageous at least. Unbelievable. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse.
What I would argue is, as long as you're engaged in open civil disobedience, in other words, as long as you're still going on GB News, as long as you're still there in the public realm, ready to take criticism, ready to enter into open debate, then you will win eventually, right?
Right, I think at this point it is now the responsibility of the mainstream media to stop platforming this man. He has basically said, it doesn't matter what I do as long as I get on the news and talk about what I want to talk about. So don't fan the flames. And I know the irony of me saying this while I am covering him, but really the climate crisis stuff that I'm bringing up, that's to the aside. This video is a lot more about how this is a genocide in the making. And quite frankly, after this, it would take something incredible for me to have to cover him. And I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up in jail. In fact, if he ends up in jail, I'll definitely make a video, because what can he talk about from jail? The answer is nothing. God, and his attempts to justify this more are just more and more embarrassing.
Let's take the example of the woman who ran in front of the horse, right, and died in the suffragettes. Everyone, you know, maybe half the people listening to this know about it. Why did they know about it? Because someone died, right? And you might say, well, no, that's okay for someone to die. Let's think about it a little bit more clearly. You're running into a horse. What about all the horses coming behind? What about those riders? What about their families? What about all the people who are going to be traumatized watching it? You see, it's not simple.
Right, you moron, since you're taking the context out of absolutely everything you are trying to justify yourself with, let's actually go through the proper context. The only person who died there was an actual suffragette who knew her own risks. It is her responsibility that she died. And you're going on about, oh, what about the previous horses and jockeys and things like that? They know the risk of going into a horse race. Horses die in horse races. Jockeys get trampled. They know this. And if it was caused by her, that's just another level on it. But they go in there knowing that they could get seriously injured or die. But the woman who did cause it was part of the protest. She essentially was trying to martyr herself. Or she was actually trying to attach something to the king's horse and ended up martyring herself by accident. But either way, it doesn't matter. This isn't some innocent bystander dying because of civil disobedience, as you call it. This is the person causing civil disobedience, getting herself killed. Completely different scenario. Please get off it. You sound like a moron. So they go in circles for another 5 minutes or so, and it's not something I can be bothered covering anymore. The man's clearly an idiot. But then, when Galsworthy clearly wants to get off the subject because saying people are going to die for your cause and you don't care, that's clearly bad optics, he then wants to obviously get off that subject and start saying this.
This podcast acknowledges that, you know, the planet is fucked up and the system is fucked up and looks to...
Can I just say, right, that's the wrong framing. Right?
And so now we go into Hallam's worldview.
Right.
Okay.
We've had 30 years of the planet is fucked up. That's classic sort of, you know, separation psychology. It's like there's a planet there and it's a little bit unfortunate that it's going to go down the drain. No, what we're talking about is the loss of people's pensions in the next 10 years, the loss of people's incomes, the mass migration of hundreds of millions of people, the indescribable injustice to people of colour in the global south because of the collective selfishness of people in the north. Right?
Sure.
We're talking about the biggest crime in human history imposed by the rich against the global poor.
Yeah, so this is the thing. The man is basically just a Marxist, but putting it in the framing of the climate catastrophe is the new genocide by the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. And, you know, because it's Britain, he adds in the massive race element as well. which is basically implying that it is rich white people doing this to poor brown and black people or whatever. And the whole thing is just designed to tug on heartstrings, and as you can probably tell by now, this is all that Roger Hallam can do, and the reason he does it is because he probably knows it's effective. Because at the end of the day, as he said right at the beginning of the podcast, doesn't care about moral issues or things like that. He just cares about being effective. So don't buy this whole crap of, oh, it's the black and brown poor that are mostly affected by this and it's the evil whitey. He doesn't care about any of that. The man just wants power and nothing else. That's why his answer is citizens' assemblies, because he knows that people are going to be supporting that, but he also knows that that is never going to happen. And if he is a true believer in any of this, then he is the biggest moron on the planet, or probably the smartest, because you have to go through some pretty good mental gymnastics to truly believe any of this. But he then says this to finish off his speech.
Let's just say what it is. It's not about saving the planet, right?
Okay.
It's preventing the genocide of billions of people.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
But
I just find it amazing that he says this, especially after the comments that he clearly made about the Holocaust. And he doesn't care about genocide. He doesn't care at all. But he must have learned this from making these comments and being absolutely smashed by the media for this. He realises that if you say something is a genocide, people will listen. And the problem with this, I'm afraid, Mr. Hallam, is that you make the word genocide mean less and less every time you say this. You clearly don't care about genocide. In fact, I go as far as to say that you probably would support a genocide against the rich people, against who you determine are your political enemies. So don't give me this crap that you care about genocide here. So that's probably the last thing I'm going to get to in this podcast. If you want to listen to the rest of it, link down in the description, but essentially the next 10 to 15 minutes, Gláeddyv asks what exactly his solutions are to these problems, and he was implying I want answers to the climate crisis, like what are your solutions to it? And basically Hallam's entire answer is just complete political change. I want my system in place. And he basically says I'm going to outsource the solutions to this problem. And I just can't be bothered going through it because that's what the system does already anyway. There will be hundreds of advisors trying to advise the system on what to do, and that's why we end up with this fight between people who are saying, oh, we can probably go net neutral by 2050, and then there are others saying, no, it needs to be done now. That's because Roger Hallam's people are already in there. And this essentially is why I'm convinced Roger Hallam doesn't care about the climate crisis. He only cares about influencing his will on other people. So there you go. The man is a maniac. The man doesn't particularly care how many people die in the current day to get to his goal, which he says is to save billions of lives in the future via saving the climate, but in reality is probably something a lot more sinister. But I suppose we will see what the future has in store for him. As usual, Insulate Britain and Extinction Rebellion and all these climate cultists are mental. The police have my consent to arrest them for causing mass disruption and harm to people. But I suppose that is my closing conclusions, and that's everything I had for you today. So, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.